Good morning, Church of the Resurrection. It's great to be with you again during this Easter season. I want to invite you to turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. This is the book that we're studying during this Easter season, and I'm so thankful to be studying it. It's been offering us such incredible guidance and care as we struggle through this new normal together. If you would turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, we'll be referring to a number of key verses throughout our time together today, and so you can hold your place there. When I look back over my life, it's interesting how just a few words or a simple statement can change one's life forever. I remember being at the altar rail in a church in downtown Fort Worth when I was about 20 years old, and just two words that changed my life forever when I said, "I do," to my bride. I can remember on two other occasions being told, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." And I'll never forget where I was on those occasions. Just a few words, just one simple statement that changed my life forever. Or maybe four words, "You got the job." Do you remember the first time you heard that? It's amazing how just a few words can change the trajectory of our life forever. It reminds me of a time when Jesus was with his disciples in the northern part of Israel, and he was training them up to be his followers. And he asked the question, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, as is typical with Peter, jumps out and sort of blurts out the answer first. And he says, "Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus, in response, says to him, "And you are Peter, you are the rock. And on this rock, I will build my church." And he says, the gates of hell, the gates of Hades, will not prevail against it, will not overcome it. Prior to this sheltering in place reality, actually it was almost 2 years ago, I traveled to Israel for a global conference with other Anglicans. And one of the places that I was able to visit, I'm going to show you a picture of it now, was a place that was known as the Gate of Hades. This was a real place in the northern part of the country, and this was the location of Jesus' conversation with Peter. You can see here in the image, there's this large entry to this massive cave, and the people in the region at this time really believed this was the gate. This was the place at which you would enter into the depths of hell. And outside of this, following the time of Christ, this became a place of pagan worship. There's all these different temples that have been built. And it's interesting that Jesus takes his group of disciples, 12 disciples, they go far north, not only north of the Sea of Galilee, but they go far north of their Jewish heritage. They're around Gentiles. They're at a place known as the gates of hell. And he's training up his disciples to know how to be this new kind of community in a place where their identity is being challenged, their sense of self is being challenged. They actually feel a bit scattered. And he even says to the one that we know out of all the disciples, the one that was most sort of flippant with his words, flippant with his reactions, he jumps out of the boat first, he blurts out the answer first. This guy that can be a little bit shaky, Jesus says, "You are going to be the rock, and I'm going to build my church, Peter, through this group of disciples and through you." At the time, I doubt Peter could possibly have understood the importance of that moment and that little phrase. But as he's penning these words that we've opened up to, they had to be in his mind. As he's penned these words to this church that now Jesus is building, even though he's ascended, Jesus is still building his church. And Peter's writing to them, and they've been scattered all over the place because of persecution. And he writes these words to them, and he had to have been thinking, Jesus has promised to build up his church. Even though you've been scattered, Peter begins to paint a picture for them of who they are as God's people. And oh, how we need to hear his words today. I chuckled this week as I prayed and wrestled with this passage, its meaning in my life and our life together as the church. It makes me think of one of those multi-piece jigsaw puzzles, like 1,000 or 3,000 pieces. And you have this picture on the front of the jigsaw puzzle. And if you see the picture, you go, wow, that's really beautiful. That's really pretty. And then you open up the box and you see all these pieces. And if you have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old and you scatter them all over the dining table, you would never imagine that all these scattered pieces and all these different parts actually fit together and make that beautiful image. Sometimes we need to just sort of stare at the picture on the box and see that which we have been called to be, created to be as the church. And that's what Peter does for us. He gives 3 descriptions of this picture on the cover of the box, if you will. And he describes who the church is as he goes through these first 10 or so verses in chapter 2. He talks about things like priest and sacrifices and construction material. And honestly, these don't seem like straightforward metaphors or descriptions for us, but I hope you'll see the picture that Peter is trying to get us to see as we look at them. The first one is this. He paints a picture of connectedness for us. He says in verse 4, as you come to him, he's speaking of Jesus, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. In verse 5, he says, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. Gone are the days, Peter is contending, where God is only attaching his presence to one physical location, like the temple or the tabernacle. Those days are gone, and he's writing to a church and he's saying to them, you guys are going to have to figure out this new normal. Guess what? It's really good news. Jesus' presence, God's presence, no longer is attached to just one physical reality. It is now connected to you as his people, the church. He's attached his presence to this new reality. And Peter says it's a picture of connectedness. He begins to use this building metaphor, and he says, you're living stones. Well, how are we connected? He says you're primarily connected to this new household of God because you are connected to the cornerstone. We know this is the primary stone, the main rock that everything else has to be in line with, or else the whole thing would crumble. He said you're connected to the cornerstone. That's where our sense of connection begins. He understood that he, like us, is a living stone, that if we get connected to the larger building, it's because we're primarily connected to Jesus Christ. I don't have a stone in front of me, but if I had a single stone, it's really not much good if it's not connected to something else. It may be a good paperweight or a door stopper, but to be of use for that which it was created for, it has to be connected to other stones. And Peter uses this imagery to say, you are a living stone, and you have a place in God's household, and it begins by being rightly connected to Jesus as the cornerstone. He goes on to say in this passage that this cornerstone, which everything else has to be rightly oriented around, is a stumbling block for some. They stumble over it because they've tried to make some other thing the main stone at which they orient all their life around. They've tried to make maybe a career or maybe a relationship or some other hobby the main thing that they've oriented all of life around. And if that's the case, then they or you or I will keep on tripping over the only cornerstone that is worthy of bearing the weight of our lives. That's Jesus Christ. And he paints this picture of connectedness, that to be part of God's household, you have to be rightly building around and upon and connected to the chief cornerstone that is Jesus Christ. This is what gives us our stability. This is also what leads us to the place to be able to say that God's household is indestructible. That no matter the challenges that come, that no matter the storms that come, that the church with a capital C is absolutely indestructible. But why? Because Jesus is the cornerstone. The whole household is oriented around something that is unshakable, and that's him. But he doesn't just stop there, and neither can we. See, it's not a picture of connectedness simply because you and I, as personal individuals, have this personal connection to Jesus Christ. He paints a picture of connectedness to one another. I didn't know about this song until this last week, but I came across this song. I didn't particularly like it, so I'm not commending you to go listen to it. But the title of the song is this, quote, me and Jesus have our own thing going. Have you heard of this? If you haven't heard of the song, you've certainly heard of the sentiment. Here's one of the lines from the song. It says, we don't need anybody to tell us what it's all about. You see, me and Jesus, we have our own thing going. And in a way, it's a kind of a country folk song trying to celebrate that you and I have access to God on a personal basis. And that's true. But what we know is that it goes a step further in our Western individualistic culture where we think that this is all just about my personal, individual, selfish relationship with God. And as long as that's sorted out, all is well. Peter contends something very different here. He paints a picture of connectedness to one another. If you're connected to the cornerstone, the only way that can be true is if you have a connection to the other stones in the household. We are connected to one another. My kids are currently, we're building lots of Legos. And the way that the new Lego boxes and toys are built is you got to have every piece or else like the whole thing doesn't work. And that's how the church is. We each have been designed and gifted and called in such a way that the whole thing doesn't really fit together if we don't have everyone leaning in as part of this connection to one another. Peter paints a picture of connectedness, both to Jesus and to one another. There's no single stone that can claim sort of sturdiness on its own. It has to be connected to the other stones and to the cornerstone. And as I think about the challenges that we're presently facing as a church, both nationally and locally, I really want to encourage you, I really want to challenge you. Would you stay connected relationally to one another in the midst of not only a time of social distancing, but a time of fracturing within our community? Not just in the last couple weeks, but in the coming months, we are facing a time where the unity of the church will be tested in significant ways. You may have seen some of these headlines that help us to see that there are real varied responses for how to reopen wisely, what it means for us to get back together again, even as a church, what it means for us to get back to our careers, to spend time with family and friends. Would you please value your connectedness to one another above your own personal views of what is wise? This means that we're going to have to be really gracious to one another because there's going to be different sensibilities across the age spectrum, across just our own sense of what is right and good. It's going to require that we value our unity with one another and that we really stay connected with one another. Secondly, Peter shows us a picture not only of connectedness, but of involvement. And he shifts the metaphor that he's using from stones to priest. As living stones, we're connected to one another in the cornerstone, but as a community of priests, there's a picture of involvement that he paints for us here. Verse 5, he says, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. And then he has the audacity to say that you are being built up to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Later on in verse 9, he says, but you are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. See, not only is his presence no longer just attached to one place, but a community of living stones, not only is that true, but gone are the days where there was just one class, one group, one tribe that could claim priesthood. Peter is showing us that God has pulled together and called together a whole community of men and women to be priest, his priest in the world. It's an amazing claim to say to this little group of Christians that had been scattered all over the place under oppression, under imperial rule and persecution. And this word priest, to use this word, it's not used very often in the New Testament. Like in the book of Hebrews when it's used, it's applied only to Jesus. And Peter says to them, church, you are a community of priests. And I just want to point out the connection to this passage in our gospel reading for the day, John 14. You see, there had been a whole time where the disciples saw their connection to Jesus and his physical presence as their sense of connection to God. And so when Jesus began to teach and talk about the fact that he was going to go away, the disciples, not only did they become fearful, they became really concerned. Well, how are we going to stay connected to God if Jesus, you go physically away from us? This is what John 14 is all about. You see, they had power because they were in proximity to Jesus. And now what Jesus does to them in John 14, Peter now relays to the church, and he says, he has filled you, ordinary men and women, with his presence. You have been filled. You have been totally identified with God, not only in his life, death, and resurrection, but now the Holy Spirit comes and he dwells within us as a community of priests. We need this picture, don't we? Because oftentimes our lives feel scattered. We don't feel much like priests. Our whole community right now feels scattered. Yet Peter shows us this beautiful vision of a connected community, a community that's a community of priests. The Latin word for priest is really helpful and instructive here. Pontifex, literally bridge builder. This is the vision of what it means to be a community of priests. A bridge builder, somebody who's standing in the gap and going to God on behalf of the people and saying, my colleagues, my neighbors, my coworkers, God, they need you. We stand in the gap. We're a bridge builder in that way. But not only does it work in that direction, it works in the other direction. And we go to the people and we say, be reconciled to God. He wants to know you. He's given his life for you. We tell the grand story of the gospel as a community of priests. This is a picture of involvement. We're active. See, priests are active in the action of worship. That's what a priest did, and that's what this community of priests does today. We involve people in connecting to God and worshiping him, in putting our eyes on him alone, making him the cornerstone of our lives. That's what priests do. They involve people in the worship of the one true God. They also get really involved in serving the greater good of their community. Priests are active in their involvement, not only in worship, but in service to others. We as a community, this last 5 or 6 weeks, I've gotten to see in a way that just individual households may not get to see, you caring for one another in some of the most beautiful ways. A bill being paid by one member for another anonymously. A group of people seeking to encourage those who are struggling with anxiety or depression, even more significantly because of the quarantine measures that we've been under. We are seeking to be active in how we serve one another, and I'm encouraged by that as I watch you, Church of the Resurrection, and I also know that there's more that we can do together as a community of priests. We're trying to form this care team, a community care team that will help us rise to this occasion, not only of greater need within the church, but within our county and community. And so I want to ask you, we've communicated it in our parish updates the last few weeks. It's also in the announcement section for this Sunday. I want to ask you that you would make yourself available to serve on that team if you're able. We need to be involved as a community of priests in serving others in an active way. So what God has done is he's attached his presence to this people called the church. He's commissioned every single person to be a priest. And then he makes these sweeping claims in the gospel reading. He tells his disciples that you are going to do greater works than I have even done. What a bold thing for Jesus to say. What a bold thing for Peter to say to us, that we're a community of living stones that's everlasting, God's household. And then we've been commissioned as a community of priests to be bridge builders between God and people and God. And then he goes on to say, lastly, that we are proclaimers. There's a picture of proclamation here in this second chapter of 1 Peter. He calls them a holy nation. We talked a greater deal about this last week, that our first and primary sense of ourselves as God's people should not be our national identity. It should never be one political party platform. We are first and foremost a holy nation representing none other than God's kingdom in this world. We are proclaiming a different kind of kingdom. And that's where Peter goes in this last detail. As we look at the picture of this jigsaw puzzle, the cover of it paints a picture of connectedness and involvement, but then proclamation of this holy kingdom that is coming. Look at verse 9. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that, there's a purpose for all of that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. See, he is saying that you and I as the church together, this isn't just something we can do individually. It's a corporate commission to a body, a household, a whole temple, a whole community of people, that we become an outpost of the kingdom of heaven. One of my favorite authors, Eugene Peterson, says it this way, that we are a colony of heaven in the country of death. We are representatives of a totally different way of being, a different way of loving the poor, a different way of protecting the marginalized and the weak. We are a different kind of people. I think that in our moment that we're in socially and culturally, there are so many, even Christians, that wonder, why bother with the church? Why even bother with this corporate reality, this institutionally struggling group of people? Why even bother with that? And Peter is giving us the answer here, and it's grander than any one local church. It's certainly grander than any one denomination. He's saying that God has attached himself to this people called the church. And there's a picture of connectedness, of involvement, and of proclamation that we have a commission as his representatives in this world. And we become an outpost of his kingdom together. Paul, in a number of places, uses this same language of citizenship and ambassadorship, where we're representing a different kind of nation. No matter where we call home, we are first and primarily proclaiming the good news of a different kingdom. Paul says in Philippians 3, for our citizenship is in heaven. That's our primary sense of self. He says in another place in 2 Corinthians that we are ambassadors for Christ. It's as though God was entreating through us to the world. We beg you on behalf of Christ, Paul says, be reconciled to God. To make a difference in this culture, in this society, in this world, we actually have to be different. Are we connected? Are we really involved as a community and priest? Are we really bold about the good news that we proclaim? We have to make a decision on these things. To make a difference, we really have to be different. How can we be different? Well, I want to invite you, would you be connected? Not only to the cornerstone, but to other living stones in tangible ways. This is one of the reasons we've prioritized the importance of being in a small group, in a Mesa group, being connected to other brothers and sisters in Christ in a way that goes beyond just a Sunday morning gathering. We've seen how important that connection is as we've had to forgo gathering together these last few weeks. One of my favorite old Charlie Brown cartoons is a little caption, a little sequence of a conversation between Linus and Lucy. And Lucy demands that Linus change the TV channel in one of these cartoons. She demands that he change the channel. And Linus asks, what makes you think that you can walk right in here and take over? And Lucy, as she often did, she holds up her hand and she says, these 5 fingers. See, individually, they're nothing. But when I curl them together like this into a single unit, they form a weapon that is terrible to behold. That's what Lucy said. Linus asked, which channel do you want? He turns away, he looks at his fingers, and as he walks away, the cartoon caption, he looks at his hands and he says, why can't you guys get organized like that? It's a silly, goofy little illustration. But what we know is that we are actually God's people in the world. We are his representatives. But it requires that we get organized, that we get connected to one another. It means that we have to get involved. We can't just enjoy the benefits without contributing to the sacrifices that are required to be the church in the world. You really have to go beyond just sort of showing up and being in a seat. You have to get really engaged and involved. My word for the day, even though I'm sharing it with you at the end of my sermon, if I could have a word for the day like they used to do on like Sesame Street episodes, it would be this, Ziklag. Have you ever heard this word? Ziklag. It's an Old Testament word. You may wonder what its connection would be to this passage in 1 Peter. I want to show you. Well, this was an Old Testament town that was actually given to David when he was fleeing for his life from Saul. The Philistine ruler gave him this town as a safe haven, and the name of the town was Ziklag. But what's intriguing to me is who chose to come and join David at Ziklag. Who chose to come, 1 Samuel 22:2 says, was everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented. Basically, the people who came to Ziklag were those who didn't really fit into Saul's kingdom, and they found their place here. And this is a metaphor in many ways for the church today. We often want our churches and our local experiences to be more like the holy city of Jerusalem, shiny, sacred, well-dressed, full of inspiration. But when you gather with any community of human beings over a long period of time, no matter how great the building is, no matter how great their resumes are, what you'll find out is it's a lot more like Ziklag than they're letting on. We are a group of misfits. We are a group of people who are distressed and discontented as the people of Ziklag. And the key to discovering the joy of being the church is not being impressed with who we are or what we accomplish together, but realizing that God has attached his presence to this community of people. And Paul and Peter and Jesus with his disciples are constantly reminding the followers of Jesus Christ that we were not called because we were the elite, the Green Berets. We were called to be his people, his representatives in the world, as a result of his utter grace and mercy. He's attached himself to us. He fills us with his presence. The Old Testament word for that is Shekinah, that God's presence, his glory presence, is connected of all things to we, the church. As broken and difficult as we can sometimes be, God has attached his presence to us. Peter ends this opening of chapter 2 by saying this in verse 10. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. What Peter is saying is, would you thank God for his presence? He's attached himself to this Ziklag community, and he works miracles in us and through us. And so, would you get connected as living stones? Would you get involved as a community of priests in this world? And would you be bold about proclaiming the good news of this kingdom? Would you indeed be a colony of heaven in the country of death? I ask this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.